Here again, and we're happy to always be in conversation, our two yeshivot with each other. So I know that when our Ramim are in Israel, they visit Yitzchak and vice versa, and we see ourselves as, to some extent, fellow travelers. Although we'll get to that in about 45 minutes. So, and I also want to note that on that note that my friend, one of our musmachim, Rabbi Zach Trubach, who just made Aliyah, actually started working Yeshivat very recently. I'm not sure how recently, but working, I think, in part to promulgate and spread some of Shagar's teachings, including in English, I believe, in the English-speaking world. So this is an ongoing project. Who's heard of Shagar? Okay, so most people have heard of Shagar. Who has read Shagar's writings? It's some length, some depth. Maybe, sort of, right? Okay, so the reason we're doing this, in part besides our relation with Yitzchak, is that Shagar, who passed away not so long ago, but it was a major figure in the Tilumi world, or major, depends on how you think about it, right? And a very important figure, and whose thought Eitan will go to articulate much more clearly than I will, so I won't try. But and also be thinking about what this does or doesn't have to say to our milieu, to use the word du jour by Lauren, by our world here as North American Jews, at least situated in North America currently. So without further ado, Eitan.
Hello everybody, I'm very excited to be here again. Before I start, one comment. Although we'll have a conversation later, I like this not to be a lecture, like a shiur, limud, so you're invited to stop me for questions, even if I'm not giving you the opportunity. Stop me in the middle, because for two reasons. First, because it's 2 p.m. and whenever a child in Israel, they would say, "Asur la'arish ben 2 ל-4." Between 4, everybody goes to sleep, so to keep you awake, try to be more engaged if you can. Second, because we are speaking about translation, as you will see, and I'm trying to translate what Rav Shagar is doing to your context, and I don't pretend to understand your situation, so I need your reaction to see what's going on, where are these things going to, what are you doing with this? Also, for my egocentric reason, I'm here also to study, not only to teach. So this is where we'll start. So I'm Eitan, I teach in Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak. Was a student in Yeshivat Siach before. Yeshivat Siach is situated in Efrat. Rav Shagar and Rabbi Dreyfus, להבדיל בין החיים לחיים, founded it about 20 years ago. A quick introduction about Rav Shagar. Shagar first is Shimon Gershon Rosenberg. In my view, the most interesting, innovative thinker in Jewish religious Zionist community. He grew up in this community, studied in Kenabi Avne, later in Yeshivat HaKotel. He taught in Yeshivat HaKotel for a few years, and even was Rosh Yeshiva for 1 year when Rav Adari took a year off. Later he left this yeshiva, founded some other institution, and was part of a place called Bet Morasha, which is one of the first, I think, combinations of yeshiva and academic studies. Yeah. In Yerushalayim. Later he founded Yeshivat Siach with Rav Dreyfus. Rav Shagar passed away in 2007, when he was only 57 from cancer. And since then, few of his writings were published when he was alive, and since he passed away, there is an institution which I have the honor to work in. We are editing the writings that he left on his computer, recording of shiurim, and still now more than 20 books are published. And 2 years ago, one was translated to English. It's called Faith, Shagar and Restored. It's published in Magid Press. There's another one on the way. I hope in a year it will be out also. Now, these books very different topics from Talmud, Shiurim, Talmud, Hasidut, Jewish philosophy, methodology of Torah study, philosophy of Halacha, sermons for Chagim, many things, and there are all other things that are on the way, and I hope we could publish them also. Also actual questions of politics and society about Israel mainly. So there are a lot of interesting things. Generally speaking, I think the two things we can say that Rav Shagar was innovative about in the context that he spoke was bringing the study of Hasidut to the Zionist Yeshivot in Israel, something that is now very prominent. But even when I was in the yeshiva 20 years ago, it was very rare. And it's something that Rav Shagar started even earlier, specifically studying Hasidut as an existential language, something that touches the personal meaning of the religious life. Second, which is maybe more famous for, is dealing with postmodern philosophy in many different ways. I had the privilege again to study from Rav Shagar in the last 4 years of his life as a student in Yeshivat Siach. Now I'm teaching his Torah in different places. I'm also working, as I said, in editing his books. So this is for the introduction. Last year when I was here, I don't know how many of you were there, we spoke about postmodernism, multicultural society. That was the direction we took. Today I wanted to take something different. I think it's a more general introduction, but you can put these things side by side in many ways. I'd like to speak about something that I think is a basic aspect of Rav Shagar's teaching, which I will call his translation of Torah religious life to the language of modern people who live in a secular world. This will be the title. I might comment before this. I like to use this term of translation. Rav Shagar, as we will see, used it by himself to speak about others, to speak about himself in some places. There are, I think, different kinds of translation in Rav Shagar thoughts, and they go in different directions. I would like to focus on translation of Torah or religious language more generally to modern secular language. I think in a way it's the most basic move that he does, but we leave the other translation for the next time, if I'll be here again. So, what are we speaking about? Translation. If you take your source sheet, okay. I have 3 little quotes from introduction that Rav Shagar wrote to his books. These are the books that were published in his lifetime. Maybe I should give a credit to a guy named Levi Morrow, which is also working in translating Rav Shagar's book to English, because he wrote in one of his courses in the academy. He wrote about an essay about Rav Shagar's introductions. So I took these quotes from there, and also some of his ideas I will be using, because it's an interesting way to see how someone presents himself. What is he doing? And as we can see, he uses the term translation. The first quote from the book Pur Agoral, Sermons for Purim, Rav Shagar writes, "It is necessary to translate the Hasidic sermons to the language of our times. I have integrated modern ideas into Hasidic trains of thought in order to translate these Hasidic ideas for us and our world." Okay, so we have a translation. Specifically here, it's the Hasidic sermon because this book uses a lot of Hasidic sources, but I think in other books he translates other texts. Sometimes generally I can say that whenever Rav Shagar was teaching something, he was translating it, and you can feel it, because if you are a new student, you don't understand what he's doing, what's the relation, what's the connection between the text he's talking about and what he's doing with it. When you get used to it, you see that there's a method that sometimes I think maybe the most important thing that someone could learn from Rav Shagar was how he reads text, and how you can take something which looks far away from you and find meaning in it and find a way to use it for yourself, for your life. So this is the first example. Second quote from book Shuvi Nafshi, which is a book about different aspects of tshuva. This is a quote that was later used in all the Shagar books for sermons for Chagim. It was quoted in their introductions. "My aim has never been simple intellectual comprehension of the material. Rather, I intend to make it substantial, motivating force in the lives of the students." Okay, so the translation has I think this is in the context of what he's doing with the text. The translation is meant to move the study that makes the text not only intellectual but also what he calls motivating force, something substantial. This is what Torah study should be, I think, through Shagar. Another example from introduction, this is a very different book. It's called Re'im Ha'ovim. It's sermons for that Rav Shagar and Rav Dreyfus said in Chupot of the Talmidim. They made a collection of these texts, one of them from my wedding, but it doesn't say, you can't know in which wedding was it. So here Rav Shagar writes in the introduction, my main effort was to respond to yearning and demand for relevance, to turn the teaching Torah expressed in the sermon into a Torah of life, which is also a Torah of truth. The Lord God is true. Why? Because He is the living God. This is the quote from Yalkut Shimoni. Hashem Elokim Emet, Lama Shu Elokim Chaim. So we can use this term maybe, Emet, Chaim, Hashem Elokim Emet, because He is Elokim Chaim. What I would like to take from this quote is that translation here is not just a methodological or a pedagogical way to translate something to make it more understood for people, because you could say generally that almost everybody who speaks with modern people that tries to teach in the Torah is doing some kind of translation. Sometimes people don't want the Torah to be translated. I just heard from someone yesterday that his father was giving a shiur in Gemara, and he was using all kind of modern terms, and people didn't like it. They want Yiddishkeit. Even if they understand it less, they want the Yiddishkeit and not anything else. But people do all kinds of translation. I think what is special about what Rav Shagar is doing is that he sees this translation as something that has a religious meaning. It's not such just an instrument for understanding. Because I think when he says that he wants to take the Torah into a motivating force in the love of the students, when he wants the Torah to be meaningful for them, it's because I think it's something, maybe a general thing I could say about Rav Shagar, and we'll see it in some of the texts that we will learn today, that this experience of finding meaning for Rav Shagar, it maybe is the core of the religious existence, maybe the basic feeling, even revelations, to find meaning in life in general, in a specific ritual, in something that you experience. This is maybe the Hasidic background that Rav Shagar is rooted in, that the Torah, mitzvot, religious life in general has to be meaningful. Yeah.
Do you want questions or no questions?
Sure. Right.
Were there certain, I don't know, ritual elements or parts of Yahudut that you found were less meaningful or less relevant? If so, what would it?
Yeah, so it's exactly what I was meant to say. I think you take meaning in a sense that sometimes the feeling of inability to understand, maybe inability to identify with what you're doing, can also be a meaningful experience if there is some context that gives its meaning. For example, I think maybe also Soloveitchik, someone who dealt a lot with this concept of akedah, of doing something that you don't identify with, but the way he deals with it makes it meaningful. Sometimes we do things that are totally meaningful for us in the sense that I have nothing to say about it, I don't experience anything about it. This, I think, may be something that is outside of what Rav Shagar is talking about as meaningful. Yeah.
When it comes to like translating ideas in language of Chassidut specifically, I remember we had a class here a couple of years ago with Professor Michael Fishbane on Chassidut, and we spoke about how even like originally a lot of the Chassidut and Torah that we know were transcribed and translated from a lot of oral Yiddish, lectures into this sort of written rabbinic Hebrew. And I wonder how, already from the beginning, the way that you're translating it literally, affects the tone. And I wonder if, how that changes for the audience and for something like this, that sometimes it can actually change the way the content is received.
Yeah, this is something that I would like to expand in a minute, that this concept of translation, also in the simple meaning when I'm speaking here in English, what happens to the Torah when you are translating it.
Yeah.
So this is a good example. I came across it recently also about Shodas Fatemet, was speaking in Yiddish, was speaking in Hebrew. What's the difference between what is said in Yiddish and what is written in his book? It's something I'm very curious about. So I'll take this example of the drashot in the chuppah. All the something that was very special for me because, you know, usually you go to a chuppah, the rabbi says something very, even very banal, very not written for this specific context, not the rabbi, I'm sure. But sometimes you come across rabbi that, you know, he's saying this in every chuppah that he had. It has no relevance to this couple, to this situation. Here I can say that Rav Shagar was it's a very demanding example because he would write special sermon for every Talmud, and he was referring to this Talmud and his role and what would be meaningful for him. Maybe I'll even steal a minute or two for really a Hasidic story. There was a Talmud who was married about maybe 25 years ago, and the Rav Shagar talked in his chuppah. A few days later, they made Sheva Brachot in the Yeshivat. So everybody was saying all that. Then they said Rav Shagar, well, maybe you say something to the Chatan. He didn't want to say. Tried to להתחמק, to avoid it. When they pushed him, he took a page out of his pocket, and he had a drasha that he prepared for this Sheva Brachot. He wouldn't want to say just something like that. If he had it reading, he was always reading from the page. So that's why we can edit it in a book later. So that's something I think, if I can take this term, God is true, and because He is a living God, maybe I can say that the Torah, which is not living, is also untrue. Maybe we can say that the Torah, which is boring, which is not related to the situation, which is not talking to the person you are talking with, is also untrue. You know, many times, the Torah is like an artificial decoration. Also, in a Seudah, in all kind of stuff. So this is kind of a very high demand, I think, for Torah study to be meaningful in this kind of way.
Another question.
Yeah.
I agree, like, Rav Shagar seems to say that we have, like, a yearning for Torah to be really relevant, but then, like, I agree with that, but then if so, then, like, why are we afraid of doing that, or why is there resistance to that? And then also, then, like, how do we respond to that kind of resistance?
I'm not sure I understand. What resistance?
Resistance to the translation, I guess.
Why there is resistance to translation?
Yeah, and then how do we respond to resistance?
Okay, well, maybe we go deeper to this concept, and if we don't have the answer, ask me again.
Okay.
So let's dive a little deeper. One of the places that Rav Shagar speaks about translation, I didn't bring this text here because I didn't want to bring too much, also not to translate too much. He has two books about 2 volumes about Likutei Moharan, Shiurim that he gave in the Yeshivat. Torah Yutet, Rabbi Nachman speaks about Targum, Lashon Targum, Lashon HaKodesh, very interesting, and Rav Shagar's Shiur speaks about Targum. He's relating to Rabbi Nachman. What is Rabbi Nachman doing? I think we can read it and say he's talking about himself. Generally, because he says that Rabbi Nachman is always talking about himself, you can say that Rav Shagar, when he's talking about Rabbi Nachman, he's talking about himself. We'll stop there and not ask who am I talking? Who am I talking about? So Rav Shagar says there that the translation we need is a translation is a kind of secularization. Translation for secular language, for secular people, for people who live in secular world. And when you think about it, or maybe I should say before, the question I would like to speak through this kind of, through this term, are the question of what does it mean to translate, because if we take this term seriously, there are a series of questions that will arise. What kind of translation we need, as I try to answer it. Also, assuming that translating is never just saying the same thing in other words, what kind of translation, what happens to the Torah when it goes through this process, and since this is a process that has meaning, that is doing something, we can ask, is it lechatchila or b'diavad? Am I speaking in English now because nebech? If it would be better if we could speak Hebrew and everybody would understand each other easily. Or maybe something new is happening here. Maybe something will come up. Again, I'll need your help in this, but because I'm doing this effort to translate, something in Rav Shagar's Torah will be changing, and maybe it's not just an unfortunate necessity, but something that reveals maybe another part in the Torah, this English-speaking Torah, this secular Torah that we will see. So all this question I think Rav Shagar talks about, and in this shiur about Torah Yutet, he speaks about, he uses the story of Rabbi Nachman about the prince who thought he was a turkey, the Hindik. Anybody knows the story? Should I make a short
turkey.
So there was a prince who got insane, story that Rabbi Nachman told, and he didn't see the turkey, he goes under the table without clothes, he eats only bones and leftovers from the table, nobody can heal him, until someone comes, a wise man, and he takes his clothes also, goes under the table, eats the bones with him, and then he tells him, you think that the turkey can only eat leftovers, it can also, or can only be naked, it can also have clothes and still be a turkey. And then he teaches him that you can sit by the table and still be a turkey. And in the end, he acts exactly like a human being, but he still believes that he is a turkey, a hindik. And Rabbi Nachman says, and he healed him. So everybody should read the story, should ask himself, is he healed, is he not? What Rav Shagar is saying in this context is that we live in a secular world. This is the table that we live under, and you can't heal someone by pulling him out of his context. You need to take the Torah for the place that he lives in and translate it to his situation. Again, we should ask, is it lechatchila, is it b'diavad? What Rav Shagar says there in this Shiur about Torah Yitet is that although I think we can avoid this question, sometimes we need to decide, for example, how do we educate our children or our students? Do we see this situation that we are already in as something that we need to deliver to the next generation? Maybe we'll try. There are a lot of people in the religious Zionist community who are educating their children in a more strict way than they did. That's something that you see a lot. Many places that are more strict, from the Gan to Bet Sefer Al Taharat HaKodesh, as sometimes call it, are people who studied in Kohed and were in Akiva and everything, but the children, they don't want them to have the same complexities that they inherited from their parents. So sometimes it is a practical question, but usually it's what Rav Shagar said, that it's a meaningless question because this is our situation, and then we can take another step. I think and say that since Hashem put us in this situation, our task is, that's what he said when he referred to this story, our task is to live l'kayam Torah mitzvot in a secular situation. This is where Hashem puts us. So we need to try to understand what does it mean. Another text in the same book about the Kotem Moran is what I have, that you have in your page. Maybe someone would like to read. I'll give another sentence of introduction. This is an essay about the Kotem Moran Tinyana Aleph, the man on the throne, Adam Shal HaKiseh. This is the title of this Torah. This is a Torah that Nachman said in Rosh Hashanah, in which he says that what a person should do in Rosh Hashanah is be Adam Shal HaKiseh. And what Rav Shagar points in the beginning of this Shiur, this essay, is that instead of thinking of Rosh Hashanah as the day which I am, let's say, usually Rosh Hashanah is the place, the day where I'm מנמיך את עצמי, משעבד את ליבי לאבי שבשמיים. רבי נחמן wants it to be, the first sentence of this story, אדם בישראל צריך שיהיה לו שליטה על המלאכים. So it's a very different attitude to Rosh Hashanah. What Rav Shagar asked in the beginning of this Torah, that why is Rabbi Nachman doing this interpretation, maybe this translation? Why does it put Rosh Hashanah when the person is in the middle, in the center, instead of Hashem maybe even, sitting on the throne? So this is how described Rabbi Nachman.
Modern heresy aims to free itself from the different ideologies and interpretations separating man from reality. At first from religious ones, but later on also from secular ones. In the eyes of the existentialist, only what one perceives in a direct way can give him certainty and redeem him from the chronic doubts accompanying the various explanations cast onto reality. In the postmodern world, this criticism deepens, and language itself is perceived as a curtain separating man from reality. It can be said that Rabbi Nachman's primal motivation is the desire to transfer faith to the realm of the real, allowing for man's encounter with God not to be mediated through faith. Thus, paradoxically, this very same impulse that brought modern man to heresy is effectuated within the arena of faith itself. This is the meeting place of heresy and faith. This immediateness resulting from reality's peeling of any possible interpretation creates this possibility. The religious world does not occur in the higher worlds, those that man can never fully know. Thereby focusing on them creates doubts. but rather occurs within the domain of man himself.
Thank you. This is, I think, very powerful in the Hus text. We'll try to see what Rav Shagar is talking about. I think it can help us understand what he means when he's speaking about secular, translating to a secular situation, to a secular world. Maybe you can say that, I think Rav Shagar assumes that for us the secular is the real, is the objective. Maybe not in every part of our life, but there is something that in many parts of our life, the secular worldview is it's a muvan me'elav. It's the immediate experience of the world in many situations. On the other hand, the religious language, the faith, is something that you need to believe in. Something sometimes it's something that you project on the immediate reality, something that demands some kind of effort. Something even sometimes you assume that if you would let it go, it just would disappear, and you will be left with the same reality that the people around you, which are not believers, live in. And sometimes we think, we feel that because religious language, because faith doesn't have this immediate reality to rely on, it relies on nostalgia to the holy past, on promises about the future. This is something I feel out when I'm teaching sometimes at Kuzari in the Yeshivat, because I think Rabbi Yehuda Levi, what he's trying to say is that other religions are always talking about other worlds, about the next world, where you get something about the king that you will meet after you will die. And he always tries to show that Judaism is not like that, but we are giving you something which is immediate, which is a true experience, or at least should be. But this is, I think, maybe a very big challenge, because this is a sentence here. I'm not sure if the translation does justice to the original text, because when Rav Shagar says that allowing for man's encounter with God not be mediated through faith, I think in Hebrew it's something like לפגוש את אלוהים בלי התיווך של האמונה. So can I have a religious experience without believing? Like just take this effort aside, and what will happen?
Without believing because it's so immediately apparent?
Because I can, yes, because
There's no
it's
need
something
for
that, well,
כאילו, עם צורך לאמונה?
I think yes, because I think because sometimes to believe is like an effort to transcend myself to because I have the suspicion that if I would just let things on, it won't happen.
Yeah, I think when we think about religion or belief, we're often thinking about a certain type of mood that we're in sometimes and not all the time, but also of a certain type of person that ever orients himself that way. So it's sort of it's an intermediary that when you don't, when you're in the other world that you sometimes need to use, but it's also like it's a filter. So maybe it's a less direct connection. It can sort of confuse.
I'm not sure I understand. You're asking the question if I'm defining myself as a believer in general sense, or do I believe in one present situation?
When you said tivuch, like mitavech, like an agent that's between us, right? So I think of it as we use sort of religiosity in whatever way we happen to define it, whatever way our world that we're in defines it. And so you often have people that feel sort of a disconnect from religion because they feel guilty about certain things that they don't live up to their community's expectation of what you need to sort of be religious, and so that can cause a disconnect between like the two essential elements, which are like God and the individual. And so if you have these like artificial man-made frameworks that you use to get to that, it can sort of confuse the connection.
Yeah, but I'm still not sure.
Okay.
I think the mediation here is it's not what society gives as a description of what it means to believe. It's maybe my internal, my emotional effort to go beyond my immediate experience. I think this is what Rav Shagar means here. The last quote you have in this page, it's also something that I like very much. Again, I don't know if the translation is good, but it's an article where Rav Shagar speaks about the Rambam, Moreh Nevuchim, and he says that the Rambam finds the love of God and his religious certainty in the stunning encounter with reality itself. So he is willing to take the gamble to its end and see the world as it is, without resorting to transcendent categories. In the wider concept, what the Rambam does in Moreh Nevuchim, his criticism about the Kalam, the Muslim philosophers, that were trying to describe how the world should look in order that our faith will be true, and that our principles of religion will be true. So you have to change the way you see the world. The Rambam always says that, criticizing that you can't change your immediate experience. There are things that you see the world in one way, in a specific way, and this is, even if the world of Rambam's immediate experience is very different from us, what Rav Shagar, I think, tries to take from him is this challenge to encounter reality itself, to maybe even to give up some, because many times what we do when we, especially I think in religious education, we always have a bag of excuses ready for when we will get questions from reality. You know, Esther Panim, Zachar V'Onesh B'Olam Haba. We have a lot of answers ready, but we won't have to really be challenged by reality. And I like the word gamble here, himur, because you can't be sure that it will work. Or maybe the religious experience that you will have from reality will be very different from the one you would have had if you had all these transcendent categories in your thinking. Maybe we'll get somewhere. I think that's what happens when you study Moreh Nevuchim. Yeah.
I have a question that I think for me will clarify this more clearly. I think based on what you just said, the audience that Rav Shagar is writing to is actually the religious audience, not the secular audience.
Yeah.
My first impulse when I read, sort of especially this business on Likutei HaMoharan, and I see it also later on, is that the encounter with the spiritual based on the everyday experience happens all the time in the secular world, and we hear what people end up reflecting is a very sort of uncertain kind of explanation of what they experience. They say things like, "I believe in something. I believe that there is a power. I believe in spirituality," but they don't have any kind of further language for it, and I think that's because they're experiencing something, but there's no structures to situate that. Yeah. So this doesn't sound to me like a message for the secular experience. It sounds more to me like a message to religious people who have so structured themselves, like you said about the list of excuses that we have, that are really not able even to have that sort of immediate experience of "I believe in something." Am I right in that? In my understanding?
Surely he's not talking to secular, but it's a bit confusing because they use these categories in the theoretical or philosophical level and also in the sociological level. The translation, I think, is for people who live in a secular world, at least in many parts of their life, where the worldview is shaped by secular theoretical assumptions, but they do inherit it, and they do have also this religious side in their life. So sociologically, they are religious. They belong, or maybe they want to be religious. All kind of confusions and misunderstanding, like you described, are happening in this situation. I think the translation is exactly meant to fill this gap that causes people to say that they believe in something very abstract, and maybe they don't know exactly what to do with it. Maybe it's what Rav Shagar means, that it's not a motivating force in their life, because they can't believe that maybe, again, I like the example of Moreh Nevuchim in the introduction. Is describing this image of the Navoch, that he's inherited some beliefs and inherited some texts that he can't believe in anymore. He has nothing to do with all these texts, with all this Ikarei Emunah that he inherited. He doesn't know how to connect it to his experience of the world. So all kind of this I think is sort of this kind of unclear statements of "I believe in something." I think what Rav Shagar does is try to, for someone who does want to preserve the connection to the religious language, to make it meaningful for him. Maybe we'll go to the next quote, because this is, I think, an example. We spoke about translation theoretically. Let's see. In my eyes, this is an example of translation that Shagar does. I don't know exactly what you expected, but this is, I think, a translation of the term Hisharut HaNefesh, immortality of the soul. This is taken from the book that was published in English. There was an article there called My Faith, and in the end of the article there are, in English it's 5. Wow. Okay. Okay. There are kind of fragments in this text. One of them is this one. "Where are my parents? I yearn to speak to them. These very yearnings, the brush with profundity, existence along with its fears and disappointments, all are laden with the meaning that is the revelation of God. Where are they? Will I have the privilege of meeting them again? I believe so. But what does it mean? How can such a meeting come about? I tend to believe that life after death is an entirely different mode of existence. The dead pass on, death is a reality, and yet an intimacy is maintained between the dead and the living because on a certain level of existence, the dead are alive. Again, even though this level is not present for me at the moment, the very faith in its existence, the very yearning for it, transformed my life. So I want to analyze it, but I'll do it quickly. I think we could deal about this question. This is a good example because I could take from this text how would I present this kind of statement from two different contradictory worldviews, maybe the classic religious language maybe, and like what the atheist would say. But the religious language would be to try to bridge the gap between the living and the dead maybe with faith. Okay, like Rav Shagar said, we'll take the sentence exactly in the middle. I believe so. Will I meet them again? I believe so. This is the way that the word believe is used, to bridge the gap between my immediate experience maybe in a secular world that the dead are gone and the faith in Yeshivat and Nefesh. I believe. You can't argue with someone when he says I believe. The atheist would say what Rav Shagar says in the following statement, but what does it mean? Okay, so you believe. Okay, but what does it mean to believe? How can you transcend or take a step from you beyond your immediate experience? So the atheist will say it's an illusion. You want to believe, but you know somewhere you know it's a fact, and sometimes it's something that Rav Shagar quotes from Sartre, that to believe, you use the word to believe in something that doesn't have any immediate experience of this. It's a sign that you are not really there, and you have to believe. And I think Rav Shagar accepts this criticism of this term, of the use of this term believe, and what he does in this text is to maybe to, instead of relying on the objective fact of Yeshivat and Nefesh, the dead are alive somewhere, he relies on his experience that the dead are still meaningful for him. This is what he says in the last sentence. Even though this level is not present for me, the very faith in its existence transformed my life. So if my faith in Yeshivat and Nefesh is meaningful for me, this is an objective fact. Okay, this is something that Shagar does in many places. He takes the objective fact of faith and says, this is something I can build on. This is something that is meaningful because it actually changed my life. It's not, I don't have to take the atheist claim and say, okay, because I don't have an immediate experience of Yeshivat and Nefesh, then I have to take it out of my life. It's meaningless. It's not meaningless because me believing that I might meet my parents and they exist somewhere, this is a true, this is an existing reality, this experience. It's not just something I say. It is an experience. This is related to what I said in the beginning, that the meaning is a religious experience. In another one of the fragments in this text, of Shagar says that although in modern life faith is criticized and looks very problematic, when you look at it from a different direction, you see that people are always believing. And the way he speaks about it, he says people find meaning in their life, people have values that they believe in. So if you're looking at faith as not as something that depends on the question if there is God or not, when the question do people believe, is faith something meaningful for them, so you see it everywhere. See that faith shapes people's life. And maybe you keep the questions for later if you have. I'll try to touch what I can stop myself from reading maybe another quotes in the time that we have. I wanted to speak about the outcome, the implications of this kind of attitude in the halachic level. What I want to stress is that I think what Rav Shagar does in this attitude that I try to describe, it blurs the distinction between the radical and the traditional or the religiously conservative, which I think is a very important distinction for how Orthodoxy describes itself. So I'd like to try to stress this point very quickly. Let's jump to the last quote from the article Religious Life in Modern Age. It's also from the book published in Magid. Rav Shagar speaks about halacha as a language. Okay, it's a big thing, but we'll take this quote. Halacha lends order to reality, structuring and anchoring the world. This structuring relates to body language, movements, inflections, and manner of speaking, all of which provide a context that incorporates the transcendent. Thus, the performance of halachic practices entails internalizing the starkness that is part of the grammar of the halachic language. Moreover, awareness of the fact that halacha manifests the divine absolute can also explain why Jewish law is always behind the times and why it should not strive to be too up-to-date. In relation to halacha, the absolute appears as resistance and disruption. In other words, the fixation neuroses that accompany the halachic lifestyle are part and parcel of that lifestyle, and one must not be too quick to describe them with some religious, psychological treatment or other. Thus, halacha should be revised only in its own language, with empathy toward its internal logic and symptoms, and not from an external vantage. I think this is another example, maybe more political than the other one, for the translation of Rav Shagar does, because I think what he does here is to try to describe halacha without the metaphysical categories that the Rambam spoke about. Then I think he draws the picture backwards. Instead of saying because Torah min hashamayim, because halacha is metaphysical, because it came from us from a different world, this is why it doesn't fit with our world, this is why it has to be up to date, this is why it doesn't, this is why we can't identify it sometimes, there's what we call starkness here, and he draws the picture backward and said, because if I am observing halacha in this manner, if I have what he calls in this text an nekuda kasha, defines the orthodoxy by keeping the translation to the difficult point. This is also another example for what translation does. Don't know if difficult is exactly the point. If I observe halacha in the way that halacha presents itself, then I will have, I could what he called incorporate the transcendent in my life. I could observe halacha in a different way, more lightly. There will be a different experience. So all the big question, I think what goes from this text is the big questions of Torah min hashamayim, the big metaphysical question of what is the Torah, human or inhuman, and what will come from this, what are the outcomes of this kind of description. In the end, they get their meaning from the way that the Torah shapes our life. And if this Torah is truly min hashamayim, if I don't observe it in such a way, so this word will have no meaning for me. I could say I believe that the Torah min hashamayim, but if I don't shomer kala kachamura, like the person that Rav Shagar speaks about in the quote that we skipped, then the Torah for me will not be min hashamayim. Like Isharut HaNefesh has to have meaning in my life in the way I experience it, and otherwise it will be just something I say that I believe in. At the same time, Torah min hashamayim, I can understand with the way halacha functions and not see the strictly observant and being not up to date as some formal thing that I should keep. When I want to update halacha and do it, I have to play with the words to do it in a halachic way. When I understand how this kind of way of keeping halacha, this is what gives it its meaning. So it works. And if I do it differently, the same I could do the same. I could arrive to the same psak, but it will have a different meaning for me. So it will work otherwise.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, I think nowadays there's a phenomenon of a lot of people who keep halacha because of the power that it has in their lives, exactly around this, how it structures their lives, in addition to other things, what it does in terms of community, but even just in terms of giving meaning and structure to their lives. But I think that they struggle in that it should have something that's more transcendent meaning. You know, what makes it not a lifestyle, and what So I would question that even when you accomplish these sort of rhythms, that Rav Shagar is talking about, does that sort of get you to the min hashamayim type of idea, to something transcendent?
I think it's a very delicate question. Like translation, it always has this kind of delicate question, because I don't think Rav Shagar says forget all these metaphysics statements and turn halacha to a lifestyle. I think what he's trying to do is to take this transcendence and see it something that I am creating through the way I observe halacha. So, like different kind of speaking. When I'm speaking about halacha from the outside, I'm speaking about it like that. When I'm teaching my son, maybe even my students, I'm speaking about Torah min hashamayim. But I always know that, like when he says, I believe So, but what does it mean? I always have this outside look, this reflection on what I'm doing, and I know that when I say Torah min hashamayim, this is the way that I'm shaping my life, because it's not an immediate fact for me.
So is it a question of the language used? Meaning somebody comes to you and says, Rabbi, I'm looking to make this Torah meaningful, like this halachic life meaningful. I don't believe in this whole metaphysics, whatever, like, but help me find the transcendent. I keep halacha religiously. We have a phrase religiously, which means ma'od makpid, but it's not religious. If somebody says it doesn't feel like would you say use the language of Min Hashamayim, and it's a question of the discourse that we shape around it. What do you tell me to help me feel the religious power of this?
I think usually we don't, when we say use the language, it's not something that you do totally formally. Maybe you can, but usually when you speak a language, it becomes meaningful. It has an effect. The way you describe halacha is also important, not just the way you observe it. Because if you observe it and all the time you're observing it and saying to yourself, but this is not Min Hashamayim, this is only a lifestyle, then you will have a different experience in what of Shagar. It will not work, it will not have this effect. So this is all part of the same thing, observing the way I understand it, even though in some place I know that I am choosing to speak in this language. It's not obvious to me. Okay, so we'll finish this. I'll just say one last statement. I think it relates to the quote that we skipped about. I think for me, for other people that I know, this kind of attitude allows for a more strict halachic observance than we would have had if we try to think about halacha in terms that we are finding how to identify with. This is what I meant when I say that it does a distinction between the traditional and the radical, because in theoretical terms it's very radical, like you asked me many questions related to this matter. In different direction, it might give place to a much more traditional halachic. So Rav Shagar, halachic for himself was very, very traditional, very strict. So sometimes I see people which were somewhere in the middle in their halachic observance, and their encounter with this kind of ideas allow them to be much more strictly observant, because they know this is a choice that they have. They don't have to rely on these metaphysical categories. Okay, thank you very much.
What we're going to do is we're going to facilitate our law for a conversation regarding Devorah, and
you're going to make a circle?
Yeah. We're going to sit around in a circle and